Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, a rare sequel from an author not known for them, and in this case, to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, his most famous work. If you enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. And don't forget to join us over on Twitch for our readings Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays at 6 p.m. Pacific. And now, on to the story. Chapter 13. Well, Captain, where are we going to begin? Asked Pencroft next morning of the engineer. At the beginning, replied Cyrus Harding. And in fact, the settlers were compelled to begin at the very beginning. They did not possess even the tools necessary for making tools, and they were not even in the condition of nature who, having time, husbands her strength. They had no time, since they had to provide for the immediate wants of their existence, and though profiting by acquired experience, they had nothing to invent. Still, they had everything to make. Their iron and their steel were as yet only in the state of minerals, their earthenware in the state of clay, their linen and their clothes in the state of textile material. It must be said, however, that the settlers were men in the complete and higher sense of the word. The engineer Harding could not have been seconded by more intelligent companions, nor with more devotion and zeal. He had tried them. He knew their abilities. Gideon Spilett, a talented reporter, having learned everything so as to be able to speak of everything, would contribute largely with his head and hands to the colonization of the island. He would not draw back from any task. A determined sportsman, he would make a business of what till then had only been a pleasure to him. Herbert, a gallant boy, already remarkably well informed in the natural sciences, would render greater service to the common cause. Neb was devotion personified, clever, intelligent, indefatigable, robust, with iron health. He knew a little about the work of the forge, and could not fail to be very useful in the colony. As to Pencroft, he had sailed over every sea, a carpenter of the dockyards in Brooklyn, assistant tailor in the vessels of the state, gardener, cultivator during his holidays, etc., and like all seamen fit for anything, he knew how to do everything. It would have been difficult to unite 5 men better fitted to struggle against fate, more certain to triumph over it. At the beginning, Cyrus Harding had said. Now this beginning of which the engineer spoke was the construction of an apparatus which would serve to transform the natural substances. The part which heat plays in these transformations is known. Now fuel, wood or coal, was ready for immediate use. An oven must be built to use it. What is this oven for? Asked Pencroft. To make the pottery which we have need of, replied Harding. And of what shall we make the oven? With bricks. And the bricks? With clay. Let us start, my friends. To save trouble, we will establish our manufactory at the place of production. Neb will bring provisions, and there will be no lack of fire to cook the food. No, replied the reporter. But if there's a lack of food for want of instruments for the chase? If we only had a knife. Well, asked Cyrus Harding. Well, I would soon make a bow and arrows, and then there could be plenty of game in the larder. Yes, a knife, a sharp blade, said the engineer, as if he was speaking to himself. At this moment his eyes fell upon Top, who was running about on the shore. Suddenly Harding's face became animated. Top, here, said he. The dog came at his master's call. The latter took Top's head between his hands, and unfastening the collar which the animal wore round his neck, he broke it in two, saying, There are 2 knives, Pencroft. 2 hurrahs from the sailor was the reply. Top's collar was made of a thin piece of tempered steel. They had only to sharpen it on a piece of sandstone, then to raise the edge on a finer stone. Now, sandstone was abundant on the beach, and 2 hours after the stock of tools in the colony consisted of 2 sharp blades, which were easily fixed in solid handles. The production of these, their first tools, was hailed as a triumph. It was indeed a valuable result of their labor, and a very opportune one. They set out. Cyrus Harding proposed that they should return to the western shore of the lake, where the day before he had noticed the clayey ground of which he possessed a specimen. They therefore followed the bank of the Mersey, traversed Prospect Heights, and after a walk of 5 miles or more, they reached a glade situated 200 feet from Lake Grant. On the way, Herbert had discovered a tree, the branches of which the Indians of South America employ for making their bows. It was the craimba of the palm family, which does not bear edible fruit. Long, straight branches were cut, the leaves stripped off. It was shaped, stronger in the middle, more slender at the extremities, and nothing remained to be done but to find a plant fit to make the bowstring. This was the hibiscus heterophyllus, which furnishes fibers of such remarkable tenacity that they have been compared to the tendons of animals. Pencroft thus obtained bows of tolerable strength, for which he only wanted arrows. These were easily made with straight, stiff branches, without knots, but the points with which they must be armed, that is to say, as substance to serve in lieu of iron, could not be met with so easily. But Pencroft said that having done his part of the work, chance would do the rest. The settlers arrived on the ground which had been discovered the day before. Being composed of the sort of clay which is used for making bricks and tiles, it was very useful for the work in question. There was no great difficulty in it. It was enough to scour the clay with sand, then to mold the bricks and bake them by the heat of a wood fire. Generally, bricks are formed in molds, but the engineer contented himself with making them by hand. All that day and the day following were employed in this work. The clay, soaked in water, was mixed by the feet and hands of the manipulators, and then divided into pieces of equal size. A practiced workman could make, without a machine, about 10,000 bricks in 12 hours, but in their 2 days' work the 5 brickmakers on Lincoln Island had not made more than 3,000, which were arranged near each other until the time when their complete desiccation would permit them to be used in building the oven, that is to say, in 3 or 4 days. It was on the 2nd of April that Harding had employed himself in fixing the orientation of the island, or in other words, the precise spot where the sun rose. The day before he had noted exactly the hour when the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, making allowance for the refraction. This morning he noted no less exactly the hour at which it reappeared. Between this setting and rising, 12 hours, 24 minutes passed. Then, 6 hours, 12 minutes after its rising, the sun on this day would exactly pass the meridian, and the point of the sky which it occupied at this moment would be the north. At the said hour, Cyrus marked this point, and putting in a line with the sun 2 trees which would serve him for marks, he thus obtained an invariable meridian for his ulterior operations. The settlers employed the 2 days before the oven was built in collecting fuel. Branches were cut all round the glade, and they picked up all the fallen wood under the trees. They were also able to hunt with greater success, since Pencroft now possessed some dozen arrows armed with sharp points. It was Top who had furnished these points by bringing in a porcupine, rather inferior eating, but of great value thanks to the quills with which it bristled. These quills were fixed firmly at the ends of the arrows, the flight of which was made more certain by some cockatoo's feathers. The reporter and Herbert soon became very skillful archers. Game of all sorts, in consequence, abounded at the Chimneys: capybaras, pigeons, agoutis, grouse, etc. The greater part of these animals were killed in the part of the forest on the left bank of the Mersey, to which they gave the name of Yakimer Wood, in remembrance of the bird which Pencroft and Herbert had pursued when on their first exploration. This game was eaten fresh, but they preserved some capybara hams by smoking them above a fire of green wood, after having perfumed them with sweet-smelling leaves. However, this food, although very strengthening, was always roast upon roast, and the party would have been delighted to hear some soup bubbling on the hearth. But they must wait till a pot could be made, and consequently till the oven was built. During these excursions, which were not extended far from the brickfield, the hunters could discern the recent passage of animals of a large size, armed with powerful claws, but they could not recognize the species. Cyrus Harding advised them to be very careful, as the forest probably enclosed many dangerous beasts. And he did right. Indeed, Gideon Spilett and Herbert one day saw an animal which resembled a jaguar. Happily, the creature did not attack them, or they might not have escaped without a severe wound. As soon as he could get a regular weapon, that is to say, one of the guns which Pencroft begged for, Gideon Spilett resolved to make desperate war against the ferocious beasts and exterminate them from the island. The Chimneys during those few days was not made more comfortable, for the engineer hoped to discover, or build if necessary, a more convenient dwelling. They contented themselves with spreading moss and dry leaves on the sand of the passages, and on these primitive couches the tired workers slept soundly. They also reckoned the days they had passed on Lincoln Island, and from that time kept a regular count. The 5th of April, which was Wednesday, was 12 days from the time when the wind threw the castaways on this shore. On the 6th of April, at daybreak, the engineer and his companions were collected in the glade at the place where they were going to perform the operation of baking the bricks. Naturally, this had to be in the open air, and not in a kiln, or rather the agglomeration of bricks made an enormous kiln, which would bake itself. The fuel, made of well-prepared faggots, was laid on the ground and surrounded with several rows of dried bricks, which soon formed an enormous cube, to the exterior of which they contrived air holes. The work lasted all day, and it was not till the evening that they set fire to the faggots. No one slept that night, all watching carefully to keep up the fire. The operation lasted 48 hours and succeeded perfectly. It then became necessary to leave the smoking mass to cool, and during this time Neb and Pencroft, guided by Cyrus Harding, brought, on a hurdle made of interlaced branches, loads of carbonate of lime and common stones, which were very abundant, to the north of the lake. These stones, when decomposed by heat, made a very strong quicklime, greatly increased by slacking, at least as pure as if it had been produced by the calcination of chalk or marble. Mixed with sand, the lime made excellent mortar. The results of these different works was that on the 9th of April the engineer had at his disposal a quantity of prepared lime and some thousands of bricks. Without losing an instant, therefore, they began the construction of a kiln to bake the pottery, which was indispensable for their domestic use. They succeeded without much difficulty. 5 days after, the kiln was supplied with coal, which the engineer had discovered lying open to the sky towards the mouth of the Red Creek, and the first smoke escaped from a chimney 20 feet high. The glade was transformed into a manufactory, and Pencroft was not far wrong in believing that from this kiln would issue all the products of modern industry. In the meantime, what the sailors first manufactured was a common pottery in which to cook their food. The chief material was clay, to which Harding added a little lime and quartz. This paste made regular pipe clay, with which they manufactured bowls, cups molded on stones of a proper size, great jars and pots to hold water, etc. The shape of these objects was clumsy and defective, but after they had been baked in a high temperature, the kitchen of the Chimneys was provided with a number of utensils, as precious to the settlers as the most beautifully enameled china. We must mention here that Pencroft, desirous to know if the clay thus prepared was worthy of its name of pipe clay, made some large pipes, which he thought charming, but for which, alas, he had no tobacco, and that was a great privation to Pencroft. "But tobacco will come, like everything else," he repeated, in a burst of absolute confidence. This work lasted till the 15th of April, and the time was well employed. The settlers, having become potters, made nothing but pottery. When it suited Cyrus Harding to change them into smiths, they would become smiths. But the next day, being Sunday, and also Easter Sunday, all agreed to sanctify the day by rest. These Americans were religious men, scrupulous observers of the precepts of the Bible, and their situation could not but develop sentiments of confidence toward the author of all things. On the evening of the 15th of April, they returned to the Chimneys, carrying with them the pottery, the furnace being extinguished until they could put it to a new use. Their return was marked by a fortunate incident. The engineer discovered a substance which replaced tinder. It is known that a spongy, velvety flesh is procured from a certain mushroom of the genus Polyporus. Properly prepared, it is extremely inflammable, especially when it has been previously saturated with gunpowder or boiled in a solution of nitrate or chlorate of potash. But till then they had not found any of these polypores, or even any of the morels which could replace them. On this day, the engineer, seeing a plant belonging to the wormwood genus, the principal species of which are absinthe, balm mint, tarragon, etc., gathered several tufts and, presenting them to the sailor, said, "Here, Pencroft, this will please you." Pencroft looked attentively at the plant, covered with long, silky hair, the leaves being clothed with soft down. "What's that, Captain? Is it tobacco?" "No, it's wormwood. Chinese wormwood, to be learned, but to us it will be tinder." When the wormwood was properly dried, it provided them with a very inflammable substance, especially afterwards when the engineer had impregnated it with nitrate of potash, of which the island possessed several beds, and which is in truth saltpeter. The colonists had a good supper that evening. Neb prepared some agouti soup, a smoked capybara ham, to which was added the boiled tubercules of the Caladium macrorhizum, an herbaceous plant of the arum family. They had an excellent taste and were very nutritious, being something similar to the substance which is sold in England under the name of Portland sago. They were also a good substitute for bread, which the settlers in Lincoln Island did not yet possess. When supper was finished, before sleeping, Harding and his companions went to take the air on the beach. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. The night was magnificent. The moon, which had been full 5 days before, had not yet risen, but the horizon was already silvered by those soft pale shades which might be called the dawn of the moon. At the southern zenith glittered the circumpolar constellations, and above all the Southern Cross, which some days before the engineer had greeted on the summit of Mount Franklin. Cyrus Harding gazed for some time at this splendid constellation, which has at its summit and at its base 2 stars of the first magnitude, at its left arm a star of the second, and at its right arm a star of the third magnitude. Then, after some minutes' thought, "Herbert," he asked of the lad, "is not this the 15th of April?" "Yes, Captain," replied Herbert. "Well, if I'm not mistaken, tomorrow will be one of the 4 days in the year in which the real time is identical with average time. That is to say, my boy, that tomorrow, to within some seconds, the sun will pass the meridian just at midday by the clocks. If the weather is fine, I think that I shall obtain the longitude of the island with an approximation of some degrees." "Without instruments? Without sextant?" asked Gideon Spilett. "Yes," replied the engineer. "Also, since the night is clear, I will try this very evening to obtain our latitude by calculating the height of the Southern Cross, that is, from the southern pole above the horizon. You understand, my friends, that before undertaking the work of installation in earnest, it is not enough to have found out that this land is an island. We must, as nearly as possible, know at what distance it's situated, either from the American continent or Australia, or from the principal archipelagos of the Pacific." "In fact," said the reporter, "instead of building a house, it would be more important to build a boat, if by chance we are not more than 100 miles from an inhabited coast." "That is why," returned Harding, "I'm going to try this evening to calculate the latitude of Lincoln Island, and tomorrow, at midday, I will try to calculate the longitude." If the engineer had possessed a sextant, an apparatus with which the angular distance of objects can be measured with great precision, there would have been no difficulty in the operation. This evening by the height of the pole, the next day by the passing of the sun at the meridian, he would obtain the position of the island. But as they had not one, he would have to supply the deficiency. Harding then entered the chimneys. By the light of the fire he cut 2 little flat rulers, which he joined together at one end so as to form a pair of compasses, whose legs could separate or come together. The fastening was fixed with a strong acacia thorn, which was found in the woodpile. This instrument finished, the engineer returned to the beach, but as it was necessary to take the height of the pole from above a clear horizon, that is, a sea horizon, and as Claw Cape hid the southern horizon, he was obliged to look for a more suitable station. The best would evidently have been the shore exposed directly to the south, but the Mersey would have to be crossed, and that was a difficulty. Harding resolved in consequence to make his observation from Prospect Heights, taking into consideration its height above the level of the sea, a height which he intended to calculate next day by a simple process of elementary geometry. The settlers therefore went to the plateau, ascended the left bank of the Mersey, and placed themselves on the edge which looked northwest and southeast, that is, above the curiously shaped rocks which bordered the river. This part of the plateau commanded the heights of the left bank, which sloped away to the extremity of Claw Cape and to the southern side of the island. No obstacle intercepted their gaze, which swept the horizon in a semicircle from the cape to Reptile End. To the south, the horizon, lighted by the first rays of the moon, it was very clearly defined against the sky. At this moment, the Southern Cross presented itself to the observer in an inverted position, the star Alpha marking its base, which is near to the southern pole. This constellation is not situated as near to the Antarctic pole as the polar star is to the Arctic pole. The star Alpha is about 27 degrees from it, but Cyrus Harding knew this and made allowance for it in his calculation. He took care also to observe the moment when it passed the meridian below the pole, which would simplify the operation. Cyrus Harding pointed one leg of the compasses to the horizon, the other to Alpha, and the space between the two legs gave him the angular distance which separated Alpha from the horizon. In order to fix the angle obtained, he fastened with thorns the two pieces of wood on a third placed transversely, so that their separation should be properly maintained. That done, there was only the angle to calculate by bringing back the observation to the level of the sea, taking into consideration the depression of the horizon, which would necessitate measuring the height of the cliff. The value of this angle would give the height of Alpha, and consequently that of the pole above the horizon. That is to say, the latitude of the island, since the latitude of a point of the globe is always equal to the height of the pole above the horizon of this point. The calculations were left for the next day, and at 10 o'clock, everyone was sleeping soundly. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. The next day, the 16th of April and Easter Sunday, the settlers issued from the chimneys at daybreak and proceeded to wash their linen. The engineer intended to manufacture soap as soon as he could procure the necessary materials, soda or potash, fat or oil. The important question of renewing their wardrobe would be treated of in the proper time and place. At any rate, their clothes would last at least 6 months longer, for they were strong and could resist the wear of manual labor. But all would depend on the situation of the island with regard to inhabited land. This would be settled today if the weather permitted. The sun rising above a clear horizon announced a magnificent day, one of those beautiful autumn days which are like the last farewells of the warm season. It was now necessary to complete the observations of the evening before by measuring the height of the cliff above the level of the sea. "Shall you not need an instrument similar to the one which you used yesterday?" said Herbert to the engineer. "No, my boy," replied the latter. "We're going to proceed differently, but in as precise a way." Herbert, wishing to learn everything he could, followed the engineer to the beach. Pencroft, Neb, and the reporter remained behind and occupied themselves in different ways. Cyrus Harding had provided himself with a straight stick, 12 feet long, which he had measured as exactly as possible by comparing it with his own height, which he knew to a hair. Herbert carried a plumb line which Harding had given him, that is to say, a simple stone fastened to the end of a flexible fiber. Having reached a spot about 20 feet from the edge of the beach and nearly 500 feet from the cliff, which rose perpendicularly, Harding thrust the pole 2 feet into the sand, and wedging it up carefully, he managed, by means of the plumb line, to erect it perpendicularly with the plane of the horizon. That done, he retired the necessary distance, when, lying on the sand, his eye glanced at the same time at the top of the pole and the crest of the cliff. He carefully marked the place with a little stick. Then, addressing Herbert, "Do you know the first principles of geometry?" he asked. "Slightly, Captain," replied Herbert, who did not wish to put himself forward. "You remember what are the properties of two similar triangles?" "Yes," replied Herbert. "Their homologous sides are proportional." "Well, my boy, I've just constructed two similar right-angled triangles. The first, the smallest, has for its side the perpendicular pole, the distance which separates the little stick from the pole, and my visual ray for hypotenuse. The second has for its sides the perpendicular cliff, the height of which we wish to measure, the distance which separates the little stick from the bottom of the cliff, and my visual ray also forms its hypotenuse, which proves to be prolongation of that of the first triangle. Ah, Captain, I understand, cried Herbert. As the distance from the stick to the pole is to the distance from the stick to the base of the cliff, so is the height of the pole to the height of the cliff. Just so, Herbert, replied the engineer. And when we have measured the two first distances, knowing the height of the pole, we shall only have a sum in proportion to do, which will give us the height of the cliff, and which will save us the trouble of measuring it directly. The two horizontal distances were found out by means of the pole, whose length above the sand was exactly 10 feet. The first distance was 15 feet between the stick and the place where the pole was thrust into the sand. The second distance between the stick and the bottom of the cliff was 500 feet. These measurements finished, Cyrus Harding and the lad returned to the Chimneys. The engineer then took a flat stone which he had brought back from one of his previous excursions, a sort of slate on which it was easy to trace figures with a sharp shell. He then proved the following proportions. 15 is to 50 is 10 is to x. 500 times 10 equals 5,000. 5,000 divided by 15 equals 333 1/3, from which it was proved that the granite cliff measured 333 feet in height. Cyrus Harding then took the instrument which he had made the evening before, the space between its two legs giving the angular distance between the star Alpha and the horizon. He measured, very exactly, the opening of this angle on a circumference which he divided into 360 equal parts. Now this angle, by adding to it the 27 degrees which separated Alpha from the Antarctic pole, and by reducing it to the level of the sea, the height of the cliff on which the observation had been made, was found to be 53 degrees. These 53 degrees being subtracted from 90 degrees, the distance from the pole to the equator, there remained 37 degrees. Cyrus Harding concluded, therefore, that Lincoln Island was situated on the 37th degree of the southern latitude, or, taking into consideration through the imperfection of the performance, an error of 5 degrees, that it must be situated between the 35th and 40th parallel. There was only the longitude left to be obtained, and a position of the island would be determined. The engineer hoped to attempt this the same day, at 12 o'clock, at which moment the sun would pass the meridian. It was decided that Sunday should be spent in a walk, or rather an exploring expedition, to that side of the island between the north of the lake and Shark Gulf, and if there was time, they would push their discoveries to the northern side of Cape South Mandible. They would breakfast on the downs and not return till evening. At 8:30, the little band was following the edge of the channel. On the other side, on Safety Islet, numerous birds were gravely strutting. They were divers, easily recognized by their cry, which much resembles the braying of a donkey. Pencroft only considered them in an eatable point of view, and learnt with some satisfaction that their flesh, though blackish, is not bad food. Great amphibious creatures could also be seen crawling on the sand. Seals, doubtless, who appeared to have chosen the islet for a place of refuge. It was impossible to think of those animals at an alimentary point of view, for their oily flesh is detestable. However, Cyrus Harding observed them attentively, and without making known his idea, he announced to his companions that very soon they would pay a visit to the islet. The beach was strewn with innumerable shells, some of which would have rejoiced the heart of a conchologist. There were among others the Phasianella, the Terebratule, etc. But what would be of more use was the discovery by Neb at low tide of a large oyster bed among the rocks, nearly 5 miles from the Chimneys. "Neb would not have lost his day," cried Pencroft, looking at the spacious oyster bed. "It is really a fortunate discovery," said the reporter, "and as it is said that each oyster produces yearly from 50 to 60,000 eggs, we shall have an inexhaustible supply there." "Only I believe that the oyster is not very nourishing," said Herbert. "No," replied Harding. "The oyster contains very little nitrogen, and if a man lived exclusively on them, he would have to eat not less than 15 to 16 dozen a day." "Capital," replied Pencroft. We might swallow dozens and dozens without exhausting the bed. Shall we take some for breakfast?" And without waiting for a reply to this proposal, knowing that it would be approved of, the sailor and Neb detached a quantity of the mollusks. They put them in a sort of net of hibiscus fiber which Neb had manufactured, and which already contained food. They then continued to climb the coast between the downs and the sea. From time to time, Harding consulted his watch so as to be prepared in time for the solar observation, which had to be made exactly at midday. All that part of the island was very barren as far as the point which closed Union Bay, and which had received the name of Cape South Mandible. Nothing could be seen there but sand and shells mingled with debris of lava. A few seabirds frequented this desolate coast, gulls, great albatrosses, as well as wild duck, for which Pencroft had a great fancy. He tried to knock some over with an arrow, but without result, for they seldom perched, and he could not hit them on the wing. This led the sailor to repeat to the engineer, "You see, Captain, so long as we've not one or two fowling pieces, we shall never get anything." "Doubtless, Pencroft," replied the reporter, "but it depends on you. Procure us some iron for the barrels, steel for the hammers, saltpeter, coal, and sulphur for the powder, mercury and nitric acid for the fulminate, and lead for the shot, and the captain will make us first-rate guns." "Oh," replied the engineer, "we might, no doubt, find all these substances on the island, but a gun is a delicate instrument and needs very particular tools. However, we shall see later." "Why," cried Pencroft, "were we obliged to throw overboard all the weapons we had with us in the car, all our implements, even our pocket knives?" "But if we had not thrown them away, Pencroft, the balloon would have thrown us to the bottom of the sea," said Herbert. "What you say is true, my boy." Then passing to another idea, "Think," said he, "how astounded Jonathan Forster and his companions must have been when next morning they found the place empty and the machine flown away." "I am utterly indifferent about knowing what they may have thought," said the reporter. "It was all my idea, that," said Pencroft with a satisfied air. "A splendid idea, Pencroft," replied Gideon Spilett, laughing, "and which has placed us where we are." "I would rather be here than in the hands of the Southerners," cried the sailor, "especially since the captain has been kind enough to come and join us again." "So would I, truly," replied the reporter. "Besides, what do we want? Nothing." "If that is not everything," replied Pencroft, laughing and shrugging his shoulders, "but some day or other we shall find means of going away." "Sooner, perhaps, than you imagine, my friends," remarked the engineer. "If Lincoln Island is but a medium distance from an inhabited island, or from a continent, we shall know in an hour. I have not a map of the Pacific, but my memory has preserved a very clear recollection of its southern part. The latitude which I obtained yesterday placed New Zealand to the west of Lincoln Island, and the coast of Chile to the east. But between these two countries there is a distance of at least 6,000 miles. It has therefore to be determined what point in this great space the island occupies, and this the longitude will give us presently, with a sufficient approximation, I hope." "Is not the archipelago of the Paumotus the nearest point to us in latitude?" asked Herbert. "Yes," replied the engineer, "but the distance which separates us from it is more than 1,200 miles." "And that way?" asked Neb, who followed the conversation with extreme interest, pointing to the south. "That way nothing." "Nothing indeed," added the engineer. "Well, Cyrus," asked the reporter, "if Lincoln Island is not more than 2,000 or 3,000 miles from New Zealand or Chile?" "Well," replied the engineer, "instead of building a house, we will build a boat, and Master Pencroft shall be put in command." "Well, then," cried the sailor, "I'm quite ready to be captain, as soon as you can make a craft that's able to keep at sea." "We shall do it if it's necessary," replied Cyrus Harding. But while these men, who really hesitated at nothing, were talking, the hour approached at which the observation was to be made. What Cyrus Harding was to do to ascertain the passage of the sun at the meridian of the island, without an instrument of any sort, Herbert could not guess. The observers were then about 6 miles from the Chimneys. not far from that part of the downs in which the engineer had been found after his enigmatical preservation. They halted at this place and prepared for breakfast, for it was 11:30. Herbert went for some fresh water from a stream which ran near, and brought it back in a jug which Neb had provided. During these preparations, Harding arranged everything for his astronomical observation. He chose a clear place on the shore, which the ebbing tide had left perfectly level. This bed of fine sand was as smooth as ice, not a grain out of place. It was of little importance whether it was horizontal or not, and it did not matter much whether the stick 6 feet high, which was planted there, rose perpendicularly. On the contrary, the engineer inclined it towards the south, that is to say, in the direction of the coast opposite to the sun, for it must not be forgotten that the settlers in Lincoln Island, as the island was situated in the southern hemisphere, saw the radiant planet describe its diurnal arc above the northern and not above the southern horizon. Herbert now understood how the engineer was going to proceed to ascertain the culmination of the sun, that is to say, its passing the meridian of the island, or, in other words, determine due south. It was by means of the shadow cast on the sand by the stick, a way which, for want of an instrument, would give him a suitable approach to the result which he wished to obtain. In fact, the moment when this shadow would reach its minimum of length would be exactly 12 o'clock, and it would be enough to watch the extremity of the shadow, so as to ascertain the instant when, after having successfully diminished, it began to lengthen. By inclining his stick to the side opposite to the sun, Cyrus Harding made the shadow longer, and consequently its modifications would be more easily ascertained. In fact, the longer the needle of a dial is, the more easily can the movement of its point be followed. The shadow of the stick was nothing but the needle of a dial. The moment had come, and Cyrus Harding knelt in the sand, and with little wooden pegs which he stuck into the sand, he began to mark the successive diminutions of the stick's shadow. His companions, bending over him, watched in operation with extreme interest. The reporter held his chronometer in his hand, ready to tell the hour which it marked when the shadow would be at its shortest. Moreover, as Cyrus Harding was working on the 16th of April, the day on which the true and the average time are identical, the hour given by Gideon Spilett would be the true hour then at Washington, which would simplify the calculation. His companions, bending over him, watched the operation with extreme interest. The reporter held his chronometer in his hand, ready to tell the hour which it marked when the shadow would be at its shortest. Moreover, as Cyrus Harding was working on the 16th of April, the day on which the true and the average time are identical, the hour given by Gideon Spilett would be the true hour then at Washington, which would simplify the calculation. Meanwhile, as the sun slowly advanced, the shadows slowly diminished, and when it appeared to Cyrus Harding that it was beginning to increase, he asked, "What o'clock is it?" 1 minute past 5, replied Gideon Spilett directly. They had now only to calculate the operation. Nothing could be easier. It could be seen that there existed, in round numbers, a difference of 5 hours between the meridian of Washington and that of Lincoln Island. That is to say, it was midday in Lincoln Island when it was already 5 o'clock in the evening in Washington. Now the sun, in its apparent movement round the earth, traverses 1 degree in 4 minutes, or 15 degrees an hour. 15 degrees multiplied by 5 hours give 75 degrees. Then, since Washington is 77 degrees, 3 minutes, 11 seconds, as much as to say 77 degrees, counted from the meridian of Greenwich, which the Americans take for their starting point for longitudes concurrently with the English, it followed that the island must be situated 77 and 75 degrees west of the meridian of Greenwich, that is to say, on the 152nd degree of west longitude. Cyrus Harding announced this result to his companions, and taking into consideration errors of observation, as he had done for the latitude, he believed he could positively affirm that the position of Lincoln Island was between the 35th and the 37th parallel, and between the 150th and 155th meridian to the west of the meridian of Greenwich. The possible fault which he attributed to errors in the observation was, it may be seen, of 5 degrees on both sides, which at 60 miles to a degree would give an error of 300 miles in latitude and longitude for the exact position. But this error would not influence the determination which it was necessary to take. It was very evident that Lincoln Island was at such a distance from every country or island that it would be too hazardous to attempt to reach one in a frail boat. In fact, this calculation placed it at least 1,200 miles from Tahiti and the islands of the archipelago of the Paumotus, more than 1,800 miles from New Zealand, and more than 4,500 miles from the American coast. And when Cyrus Harding consulted his memory, he could not remember in any way that such an island occupied in that part of the Pacific the situation assigned to Lincoln Island. End of chapter 14. Well, they're still alive. Let's see what happens next, shall we? If you've enjoyed this sort of content, I hope you'll remember to hit the like and subscribe, smash that bell icon, and leave a comment. It really helps us out. Good night.